At 11:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 12th, three United States Navy vessels altered course in the South China Sea and began moving directly towards Second Thomas Shoal, a contested reef in the Spratly Islands, where a rusting Philippine warship sits deliberately grounded as a territorial marker. What happened next represents the most significant shift in South China Sea dynamics in over a decade. And Beijing's response reveals something the Chinese Communist Party desperately does not want the world to understand. The South China Sea carries $3 trillion in annual trade through its waters. Approximately 80% of China's energy imports transit this corridor, along with 60% of Taiwan's trade, 40% of Japan's exports, and critical supply chains connecting Southeast Asia to global markets. The sea contains proven oil reserves of 11 billion barrels and an estimated 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas beneath its floor. Control of these waters determines energy security, economic leverage, and military positioning for half the world's population. For the past 15 years, China has systematically constructed artificial islands, installed military infrastructure, deployed Coast Guard vessels, and asserted sovereignty claims that international law explicitly rejected in 2016, building what defense analysts describe as the most comprehensive fait accompli in modern geopolitical history. That strategy just encountered something it cannot overcome. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because what the United States Navy just demonstrated in the South China Sea changes the strategic calculus for every nation in the Indo-Pacific. And you need to understand exactly why Beijing's 15-year plan to dominate these waters is collapsing faster than any analyst predicted. The operation began 72 hours earlier, when the guided missile destroyer USS Spruance, the littoral combat ship USS Mobile, and the supply vessel USNS Wally Schirra departed Subic Bay in the Philippines as part of what naval observers initially assumed was routine freedom of navigation operations the United States has conducted for decades. The Spruance is an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer displacing 9,200 tons, measuring 509 feet in length, carrying a crew of 380, and equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles capable of striking targets 1,000 miles inland, SM-3 interceptors for ballistic missile defense, torpedoes, and a Mark 45 5-inch gun that fires 20 rounds per minute with a range exceeding 13 nautical miles. The Mobile is a Freedom-class littoral combat ship designed specifically for shallow water operations, displacing 3,500 tons, reaching speeds above 45 knots, and carrying anti-surface missiles, a 57-millimeter gun, and helicopter detachments for extended surveillance and strike operations in contested littoral zones. This combination of deep water firepower and shallow water maneuverability represented something Beijing had not encountered before in these waters. The vessels maintained radio communication with United States Indo-Pacific Command Headquarters in Hawaii and filed standard maritime notices indicating their planned transit routes through international waters adjacent to Chinese-occupied Mischief Reef and Subi Reef, two artificial islands China constructed by dredging 150 million cubic meters of seafloor and depositing it onto submerged reefs, then installing 3,000-meter runways, hardened aircraft shelters, radar installations, and anti-ship missile batteries on each location. China declared 12 nautical mile territorial waters around these features despite the 2016 Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in The Hague that explicitly stated China's claims have no legal basis and its artificial islands generate no territorial waters under international law. For 7 years, China ignored that ruling. Beijing's Coast Guard vessels harassed Philippine fishing boats, and Chinese military aircraft operated from the island bases as though the international verdict never occurred. The United States conducted periodic freedom of navigation operations that sailed within 12 miles of the features to demonstrate rejection of China's claims. Beijing protested each operation, and the pattern repeated without consequence. This time, the pattern broke. At 9:15 a.m. local time, the Spruance and Mobile began accelerating towards Second Thomas Shoal, rather than conducting the standard 12-mile transit and departure. The BRP Sierra Madre, a World War II-era Philippine tank landing ship, has sat deliberately grounded on the shoal since 1999, serving as both territorial marker and habitation for rotating Philippine Marine detachments who maintain the vessel as a physical assertion of sovereignty. China has blockaded the shoal repeatedly, prevented resupply missions, and demanded the Philippines remove the vessel, creating one of the most visible friction points in the South China Sea. The American vessels did not merely transit nearby. They anchored too, 8 nautical miles from the shoal, within what China claims as territorial waters, and launched rigid-hull inflatable boats carrying supplies directly to the Sierra Madre, while the destroyer maintained air defense posture and the Mobile deployed its helicopter for surveillance coverage of approaching Chinese vessels. The Chinese response was immediate and reveals the operational limitations Beijing's strategy has created. The China Coast Guard vessel 5901, a 12,000-ton cutter larger than most destroyers, began moving toward the shoal at maximum speed from Subi Reef, 22 nautical miles to the northwest. Two Type 056 corvettes departed Mischief Reef, 18 miles to the south. A Y-8 Maritime Patrol aircraft scrambled from Woody Island in the Paracels, 430 miles northwest. The response demonstrated China's quantitative advantage in the immediate theater, where Beijing maintains 130 Coast Guard vessels, 225 maritime militia ships, and forward-deployed naval units operating from 7 militarized artificial islands. What the response also demonstrated was the constraint that prevents China from translating numerical advantage into operational freedom. The Spruance did not move. The destroyer maintained position too, 8 nautical miles from the shoal, its fire control radars tracking every approaching Chinese vessel, its Aegis combat system providing real-time targeting data on surface contacts within 200 miles, and its vertical launch cells containing 96 missiles ready for immediate engagement. The Mobile positioned between the destroyer and the shoal, its 57mm gun trained on the approaching Coast Guard cutter, its crew at battle stations. The supply operation continued. Philippine Marines aboard the Sierra Madre received food, water, construction materials, and communications equipment, while American sailors in rigid-hull inflatables made multiple trips between the supply vessel and the grounded warship, filmed by news crews aboard chartered boats positioned at the 12-mile line. The China Coast Guard vessel 5901 stopped 6 nautical miles from the American destroyer. The Type 056 corvettes maintained station 8 miles south. The Y-8 circled at 15,000 feet, 40 miles distant. Chinese state media issued statements condemning the operation as dangerous provocation threatening regional peace. The Foreign Ministry summoned the American ambassador. Global Times published editorials warning of potential military confrontation. None of it changed the operational reality that every military analyst watching the encounter understood instantly. China's Coast Guard vessels carry water cannon and occasionally ram fishing boats. They do not engage United States Navy destroyers. China's corvettes carry anti-ship missiles with 90-mile range against targets without air defense. They do not engage Aegis destroyers that detect, track, and intercept supersonic missiles at ranges exceeding 200 miles. The J-11 fighters that scrambled from Subi Reef 30 minutes into the operation circled 60 miles away, unwilling to enter the engagement envelope of a destroyer carrying SM-2 surface-to-air missiles with a 100-mile range and SM-6 missiles that intercept targets at 250 miles while simultaneously engaging surface ships. The distance at which Chinese vessels stopped was not random. The Coast Guard cutter halted at precisely the range where its water cannon would be ineffective, but approaching closer would constitute deliberate harassment that could justify defensive measures. The corvettes positioned themselves at the maximum range of their optical targeting systems, close enough to photograph the operation, but far enough to avoid triggering automatic defensive responses from American fire control radars. Every decision demonstrated tactical sophistication. Every decision also demonstrated the fundamental constraint that Chinese forces cannot close to effective engagement range against American naval units without accepting catastrophic losses. This constraint has operational consequences that extend beyond a single encounter. China's People's Liberation Army Navy operates 340 warships, making it the largest navy in the world by hull count. That fleet includes 2 aircraft carriers, 8 Type 055 cruisers, mounting 112 vertical launch cells each, 25 Type 052D destroyers with 64 launch cells each, 49 frigates, and 79 corvettes designed for coastal defense and anti-submarine warfare. The quantitative advantage is real. The qualitative limitation is equally real. Chinese destroyers lack the integrated air defense capability of American Aegis systems that can simultaneously track 300 targets and engage 18 simultaneously. Chinese carriers operate J-15 fighters with combat radius 40% shorter than American FA-18 Super Hornets and rely on ski jump launch rather than catapult systems, limiting payload and fuel capacity. Chinese submarines are louder than American Virginia-class boats, making them detectable at greater distances and vulnerable to preemptive targeting. The numerical advantage that looks overwhelming on paper fragments under operational analysis into a force that can dominate regional powers but cannot achieve sea control against the United States Navy in contested waters. The operation lasted 6 hours and 17 minutes. The supply transfer was completed. The American vessels departed at 3:32 a.m. local time, transiting directly past Mischief Reef at 2 nautical miles rather than 12, broadcasting automated identification system data that allowed the world to track their exact position in real time. Chinese vessels followed at a distance, photographed the transit, and filed protests. The destroyers and corvettes did not close within 8 miles. The pattern has repeated twice more in the 18 days since the initial operation, with different United States vessels conducting identical missions under identical conditions, producing identical Chinese responses that demonstrate Beijing's operational paralysis. The USS Ralph Johnson, another Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, conducted a third supply mission on November 24th with additional medical supplies and construction materials. The littoral combat ship USS Gabriel Giffords executed a fourth resupply mission on December 1st. Each operation followed the same operational profile: anchor within 3 miles of the shoal, conduct resupply operations under armed escort, maintain defensive posture, depart through Chinese-claimed territorial waters. Each operation generated identical Chinese protests and identical Chinese inability to interfere with American naval movements. The message is unmistakable and transforms the strategic landscape in ways that extend far beyond a single supply mission to a grounded warship. For 15 years, China's strategy in the South China Sea relied on what defense strategists call salami slicing, taking incremental actions too small individually to justify military response, but cumulatively establishing de facto control. Construct an artificial island, install a runway, deploy Coast Guard vessels, harass fishing boats, block resupply missions, declare air defense identification zones. Each action violated international law. None individually crossed the threshold that would trigger military confrontation with the United States. The cumulative effect was Chinese control of 7 artificial islands, 3,200 acres of reclaimed land, 72,000 square miles of claimed territorial waters, and effective exclusion of other nations' fishing vessels, energy exploration, and naval operations from areas international law explicitly defines as belonging to no one or to other claimant states. The strategy worked because it avoided direct confrontation while steadily expanding China's operational footprint. The strategy's vulnerability was always this: the United States Navy possesses overwhelming conventional superiority in any direct engagement. China knows this, and Beijing's entire approach depends on avoiding situations where that superiority becomes operationally relevant. The artificial islands are fixed targets vulnerable to precision strike. The Coast Guard vessels cannot engage destroyers. The corvettes and frigates operating from the islands cannot defeat an Aegis destroyer in missile combat. The J-11 and J-16 fighters, based on the island runways, cannot achieve air superiority against FA-18 Super Hornets operating from a carrier strike group supported by E-2D Hawkeye surveillance aircraft and EA-18G Growler electronic warfare platforms. China built military infrastructure on artificial islands to project power into the South China Sea. But that infrastructure becomes a strategic liability the moment direct confrontation becomes unavoidable, because it is fixed, targetable, and dependent on supply lines that American submarines can sever within hours of conflict initiation. The supply missions to Second Thomas Shoal force China to choose: escalate to military confrontation and expose the operational limitations of 15 years of construction and expansion, or accept that American vessels will operate freely within areas China claims as territorial waters, demonstrating that Chinese sovereignty claims lack practical enforcement capability. Beijing chose the second option. That choice reverberates across the region. The economic implications extend beyond the immediate territorial dispute. China's Belt and Road Initiative invested $940 billion in infrastructure projects across 149 countries, with Southeast Asian nations receiving $250 billion of that total conditional on tacit acceptance of Chinese South China Sea claims. Malaysia suspended energy exploration in disputed waters. Vietnam delayed joint development projects with American firms. Indonesia relocated fishing operations away from contested zones. The Philippines signed defense agreements with China that restricted American basing access. Each decision reflected calculation that China's de facto control of the South China Sea was permanent reality that required accommodation regardless of international law. The United States just demonstrated that de facto control is illusory when China cannot prevent American naval operations in the exact locations where Beijing claims sovereignty. The financial calculations that drove these decisions are now being recalculated. Malaysia's suspended energy projects in the Natuna Sea represent $18 billion in potential revenue over 15 years from natural gas fields containing an estimated 14 trillion cubic feet of reserves. Vietnam's delayed joint development agreements involved American energy companies prepared to invest $22 billion in offshore drilling platforms that would generate $2 billion annually in export revenue. Indonesia postponed fishing fleet modernization that would have created 85,000 jobs and increased annual catch value by $7 billion. The Philippines accepted Chinese infrastructure loans worth $24 billion, carrying interest rates averaging 3 percentage points higher than World Bank alternatives in exchange for commitments to limit American military access. Every economic concession extracted by China depended on regional governments believing Chinese control of the South China Sea was irreversible. That belief is dissolving. The diplomatic realignment follows the economic reassessment. When governments conclude that accommodating Chinese demands produces costs without corresponding security benefits, diplomatic positions shift rapidly. The pattern is visible across Southeast Asia. Thailand announced it will purchase American F-35 fighter aircraft rather than Chinese J-10 fighters, reversing a procurement decision made 18 months earlier under Chinese pressure. Singapore expanded port facilities at Changi Naval Base to accommodate larger American vessels and increased berthing capacity by 40%. Cambodia, historically China's most reliable Southeast Asian ally, declined to renew an agreement allowing Chinese military exclusive access to Ream Naval Base, citing constitutional restrictions on foreign bases that suddenly became relevant. Each diplomatic shift represents a government repositioning based on demonstrated capability rather than diplomatic assurance. The response from regional governments has been rapid and consequential. The Philippines announced it will resume joint military exercises with American forces at 8 bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, including 3 installations that provide direct access to the Spratly Islands. Vietnam invited United States Navy port visits to Cam Ranh Bay for the first time since 1975, offering repair facilities and logistics support that position American destroyers 950 miles closer to contested waters than Yokosuka or Guam. Indonesia declared it will proceed with natural gas exploration in the Natuna Sea, despite Chinese protests, with security provided by American and Australian naval vessels operating under coordinated patrol agreements. Malaysia signed a defense procurement agreement with the United States for anti-ship missiles and maritime patrol aircraft valued at $8 billion over 6 years. Each decision represents a government concluding that Chinese threats lack credibility when China cannot stop American destroyers from anchoring in waters Beijing claims as its own. The military shift is equally significant. Japan announced it will permanently base 2 destroyers in Singapore, positioning them 1,100 miles closer to the South China Sea than Yokosuka. Australia committed to doubling naval exercises in Southeast Asian waters. India signed agreements for coordinated patrols connecting the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. South Korea pledged to participate in multilateral freedom of navigation operations. The network of American treaty alliances and security partnerships that China's salami slicing strategy aimed to fragment is instead consolidating around the demonstrated reality that American naval power provides the security guarantee that allows smaller nations to resist Chinese pressure. The technological dimension adds another layer to China's strategic problem. The artificial islands rely on submarine cables for communication, satellite links for reconnaissance, and regular supply flights for food, fuel, and maintenance. Those dependencies create vulnerabilities. American submarines mapped every cable route. Satellites track every supply flight. Cyber capabilities penetrate communications networks. In peacetime, these capabilities remain latent intelligence assets. In crisis, they become weapons that can blind, isolate, and starve the island garrisons without firing a shot. China built the islands assuming they would serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, projecting power across the South China Sea. They function that way only if the United States allows it. The historical parallel is instructive. In 1982, Argentina occupied the Falkland Islands, calculating that Britain would not fight a war 8,000 miles from home over rocky islands with 3,000 inhabitants. The calculation failed. Britain dispatched a task force, sank the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano, established air superiority, and retook the islands in 74 days. The lesson was not that Britain possessed superior military technology, though it did. The lesson was that distance and geography do not prevent a great power from projecting force when political will exists, and miscalculating an adversary's willingness to use force produces catastrophic consequences. China built artificial islands calculating the United States would accept their existence rather than risk confrontation. That calculation assumed away the possibility that America would demonstrate its ability to operate freely in disputed waters without escalating to conflict, forcing China to either accept American presence or start a war China cannot win. Beijing now faces the consequences of strategic choices made during 15 years of island construction. The islands cannot be abandoned without admitting the entire project was wasteful folly. The islands cannot be defended against American conventional forces without escalation to conflict that risks Chinese Communist Party survival. The islands cannot serve their intended purpose of excluding American military presence if American destroyers can anchor wherever they choose, regardless of Chinese protests. China spent an estimated $30 billion building these installations, deploys thousands of military personnel to garrison them, and based its entire South China Sea strategy on their existence. That investment is now an albatross around Beijing's strategic neck, providing America with fixed targets, creating logistical burdens, and demonstrating operational limitations that undermine Chinese credibility across the Indo-Pacific. The question remaining is how far the United States will press this advantage. The supply missions to Second Thomas Shoal could expand to include resupply of Philippine installations on other contested features. Freedom of navigation operations could transition from passing within 12 miles of Chinese artificial islands to anchoring beside them for extended periods. American vessels could escort Philippine fishing boats into areas where Chinese Coast Guard vessels previously enforced de facto exclusion zones. Each escalation forces Beijing to choose between military confrontation it cannot win or acquiescence that erodes the credibility sustaining China's entire regional strategy. The trajectory is clear. China's salami slicing worked because it avoided direct confrontation. The United States is now imposing direct confrontation without escalating to war, forcing China to confront the reality that everything built on those artificial islands depends on American restraint rather than Chinese capability. The clock is running. Indonesia plans natural gas exploration starting in January. Vietnam scheduled joint development negotiations with American energy firms for February. The Philippines will conduct military exercises at Palawan in March. Each event will test whether China can enforce its sovereignty claims when American naval forces provide security. Each event will reveal whether Beijing's threats represent genuine military capability or diplomatic theater without operational substance. Each event will determine whether 15 years of construction, $30 billion in expenditure, and countless diplomatic confrontations produced actual strategic advantage or merely created the illusion of control that dissolves under pressure. What happens next will determine the geopolitical order across the Indo-Pacific for decades to come. If China cannot prevent American destroyers from operating freely in waters Beijing claims as sovereign territory, then Chinese sovereignty claims are words without meaning. If sovereignty claims are words without meaning, then every territorial dispute, every resource extraction conflict, and every security arrangement across the region gets rewritten based on demonstrated capability rather than asserted authority. If demonstrated capability replaces asserted authority as the foundation of regional order, then the 15 years China spent constructing artificial islands accomplished nothing except creating fixed targets that prove Chinese weakness rather than Chinese strength. The question is not whether Beijing understands this. The question is what Beijing can do about it when every option except accepting American naval dominance risks war. China cannot win. The answer to that question is being written right now in the waters around Second Thomas Shoal, and every government in Southeast Asia is watching very carefully to see which direction it goes.